Hey, woodworkers. Have you ever felt like you're drowning in requests from everyone and their dog for those big month-long woodworking projects? My wife's still waiting on that cruise ship duck holder cabinet. It's been 3 months and I haven't even started. But sometimes we all need quick and easy to build gifts, especially at the last minute. Today, I've got something special for you. 3 awesome one-day projects that go beyond your usual cutting board. From super simple to more intricate, I'll show you how to whip these up fast. So stick around because I got a shortcut that'll make these projects a breeze. Let's kick things off with our first project, a deck rail planter box. Once we got our board selected, it's time to trim them down to size. We'll end up with 5 pieces, 2 sides measuring 36 inches, a bottom piece that's 24 inches long, and a couple end pieces coming in around 4 inches each. Remember when I talked about a shortcut to speed things up earlier? Well, here it is. I've been making these planter boxes for years, and when I first started, I created this template. It's got the center line marked out and all the angles for the boards laid out perfectly. This template lets me make precise copies of the box size without measuring and laying out all the angles. I slap a center line on my rough cut board, I grab a Sharpie and trace away. Now this template does more than save time on layout. Stick around because I'll show you its other handy uses in just a minute. In my small shop, most of my tools are on wheels, so when it comes time to rough cut the planter sides, I roll out the bandsaw, set it up, and grab my pieces to cut. I use a thick Sharpie line instead of a thin pencil line because staying within the lines wasn't my thing as a kid. So following a trace line on my lumber, let's just say it's not my strong suit as an adult either. To cut out the sides, I start with the angle cuts on the ends of the side profile. Once those are done, I cut out the bottom angled recess. I begin with the angled cuts, then make a long straight run that connects the 2 angles. I do these cuts on both sides of the flower box. Now that all the sides are rough cut on the bandsaw, oh, quick tip, if you don't have a bandsaw, you could also make those cuts with a jigsaw. Here's where the second advantage of my template comes in handy. With the layout of the pieces already marked out, I can use the screws to secure the template to the side piece. The screw holes left behind will actually mark where I'll later assemble the flower box. I align my template at the top of the side, making sure the center line of the template matches up perfectly with the center line on the side. Once they're attached, there should be a visible overhang of the rough cut piece all around the template, assuming I nailed those bandsaw cuts. With the template securely attached to my piece, I can bring it over to my router table. I've got a bits and bits spiral flush cutting bit all set up, along with a top mounting bearing. Wait, is it on the top or is it on the bottom? It always confuses me. Anyway, if you're using a handheld router instead of a router table for this operation, you'd flip the whole setup so the template is underneath and the bearing would be on the bottom and right along the template. And that's where my confusion always kicks in. But since I'm using a router table, the template stays on top and the bearing follows along the edge. This neatly trims the side piece to the exact size of the template and smooths out the edges, which means less sanding for me later. And anything that cuts down on sanding is a win-win in my book. When the first side is done, I disassemble the template and attach it to the other side piece. Then I do exactly the same thing. This results in 2 side pieces that are identical. Remember earlier when I said the board thickness was 7/8 of an inch? Well, eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed my template is set up for 3/4 of an inch thickness. So before I can put anything together, I need to take a quick trip to the planer and thickness down on my stock to match that 3/4 of an inch thickness. Okay, we're ready to begin some assembly. But the first thing I need to do is recess the screw holes using a countersink bit. I'll make sure to sink them deep enough so I can later install plugs to hide those screws nicely. It's now time to glue everything up.
I have a bad feeling about this.
So this is where most of my stress kicks in during a project. Even with all the dry bits and prep work, I always manage to mess something up. To tackle that, I'm using my prep parts here. I've got the side without glue on the table and I'm placing the end pieces on the top for support. They're already cut to the perfect width at 5.5 inches. Now that I've got my support pieces all set up, I'm spreading glue along the bottom edge of the planter's base. I'm aligning it with the center mark on the side piece. Once it's lined up, I attach one screw, then move to the other end, double check the alignment, and drive in the next screw. After wiping away any excess glue, it's time to drive the rest of the screws. Once that's all done, I can flip the whole thing over and repeat the process on the other side. Next up is the two end pieces. Take your rough size end piece and fit it snugly into place. Grab a sharp pencil and mark where it meets the top flush and make a mark. Once you've got your marks, it's time to trim it down to final size using the miter saw. Now spread some glue along the edges, slide the piece into position, and then drive in your screws from the side of the box to secure it. Repeat this whole process for the other end of the deck rail box, and just like that, assembly is done. At this point, you could sand and finish everything now, but let's be real. Who wants to stare at those shiny screw heads day in and day out? Not me. So here's what I did. I grabbed a plug cutter, chucked it up in my drill, and cut out a bunch of plugs from a scrap piece of cedar. Next, I dabbed a bit of glue on each plug and put some glue inside the screw holes, then firmly pressed the plugs in. Once the glue dried on the plugs, I grabbed a flush cutting handsaw, trimmed them down, smoothed everything out with some sanding, and then applied a semi-transparent cedar stain.
I want more.
Okay, our next project is a cedar planter that can hold up to a 9-inch flower pot. It's versatile. It can be hung, sit on a table, or grace your porch stairs. And trust me, it's one of the easiest and quickest skips you can make. First, I mark out 39 inches on one of the cedar boards. This length will give us enough to cut all the parts we need for the box. Then, I take it to the miter station and trim it down to 39 inches. Since the board is 7/8 of an inch thick, I want to bring that down to about 3/4 of an inch. So I grab the planer, roll it out, and run the board through it a few times until it's nice and even at that 3/4 of an inch thickness that I'm aiming for. At the table saw, I adjusted the table saw fence to cut 3/4 of an inch wide strips. Each strip will be 3/4 of an inch square and 39 inches long. I'll keep making these cuts until I have 6 of these strips ready to go. At the miter saw, I set up a stop block that will result in a cut that will be 9 inches long, and I will get 4 cuts per strip for a total of 24 9-inch strips. I made this simple jig to make assembly go faster and make all the planter side look uniform. On a scrap piece of plywood, I glued 4 pieces of scrap wood thicker than the planter pieces themselves. It was assembled to make a 9-inch inside square. It has lines drawn on the plywood, so I know where to place the bottom layer pieces. The bottom layer has 4 pieces that center on the lines. Once they are in place, I dab some waterproof glue on each of the 4 pieces. Then, we grab 2 more pieces and place them perpendicular to the bottom 4 pieces, making sure they are pushed up tight against the walls of our jig. Then, using a brad nailer with 1 1/4 brads loaded, I shot a brad into each corner, and then another brad at each intersection of the pieces. Okay, next we have to build some layers. We'll repeat the same steps a couple of times. It's a bit like putting together a Lincoln log house from your childhood. You've got to orient the pieces right and keep it consistent. Start however you like, just make sure each layer follows the same pattern. First, I place the horizontal pieces, dabbing a bit of glue on the ends of each one. Then slot in the vertical pieces. I then use a brad nailer with 1 1/4 inch brads to secure each corner. Keep at this until you used up all the pieces to form all the layers. By the end, you should have 2 leftover pieces. Okay, so here's where I made a big mistake. I didn't plan ahead or think this through. I wanted to hang this container with chains and a hook, but I thought staining the pieces beforehand would make things easier. Turns out that decision came back to haunt me. When I started assembling with nails, I was thinking the planter would sit on a table, not hang. I didn't consider the weight of a hanging flower pot or how the glue wouldn't stick well to the stained surfaces. And trust me, those brad nails didn't hold up once I tried hanging it. So, you're watching me in the workshop, staining all the pieces first, hoping you can learn from my goof. And to top it off, when I finally get to assembly, I skip the glue and use brad nails, still in my delusion. Let's say, if I had blooper reels, the outtakes would be longer than this whole video. Long story short, after several tries, I had to take it apart and use construction adhesive to make sure it could hold a plant when hung. Here's how it looked after I finally got it together.
Oh, and last but not least,
moving on to our third gift, which is the most complicated and satisfying of the 3 projects. Speaking of satisfaction, if you got something out of this video, Whether it was knowledge, a laugh, or even utter perplexion at my crafting processes, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like, subscribe, and bell buttons. It would mean a lot and help my channel and myself grow. This journey into content creation is new to me, and I'm committed to making each video better than the last. I genuinely hope that you will follow along. Now, this planner will be crafted entirely from cedar, and trust me, this table would be a lot more time consuming if I didn't have one more template, one more trick up my sleeve. After gathering the stock I need for my table, the next step is to make a 2-panel glue up, so I marked out the rough to oversized lengths I'll need to create these 2 panels. Alright, these panels will be roughly 36 inches long and 14 inches wide, so I take the marked stock over to the miter saw, line up my marks, and start cutting out 6 pieces for the panels. Now, I've got one last trick up my sleeve. Well, it's too big to pull out of my sleeve, but here's my final template that really speeds up the table building process. If you're interested, I've got all the jigs and templates used today as PDFs. If you want to snag a copy of those plans, check the description below and shoot me an email with the subject line Planner Plans. In the email, tell me what Coach from Cheers said at the beginning of the segment, and I'll gladly send you a free copy. Using the template, I'm figuring out how to maximize my stock without wasting any material. The table's going to be 12 inches wide at its widest point, and my boards are only 5.5 inches wide, so I'll need to trim about 2 inches off of 2 of the 6 boards and stash the rest for another project. Since this is going to be a panel glue up, and we want all the edges to come together nicely without having to use a huge amount of clamping pressure, I take all the pieces to the joiner and join all the edges that will be glued together. After I was done jointing, I laid out the boards the way I wanted them to look, and then I used a chalk triangle to keep them oriented correctly throughout the assembly process. Then I take my template and position it on the boards, orienting it to look the most pleasing. Since I'm planning to join these boards with biscuits, I need to mark out where the flower pot cutouts will be. I'd rather avoid making the cuts that expose my biscuits if possible. Unfortunately though, the biscuit at the narrowest part of the table will end up showing. With all the biscuit locations marked out, I use my biscuit joiner and make number 20 biscuit slots in all the locations specified. It's time for some glue up. Placing glue in all the biscuit slots and the edges of all the boards, I position them in my clamps, smear the glue with my finger, slip the biscuits into the slot, flip the boards over and push them together. Once I have them oriented correctly, I close the clamps and tighten them until I get just a tiny bit of squeeze out at the joints. Once I cleaned up some of the squeeze out, I set the panel aside. I removed the clamps once the glue had dried, then placed the panels on the assembly table. Next, I laid my template on the panel and grabbed a Sharpie with a wide tip to trace its shape onto the wood. For the 45-degree cuts, I marked a couple of spots, flipped the panel, and duplicated the line on the other side of the board. This step sets me up to head over to the table saw and trim away the excess material. Of course, you could always use a bandsaw or a jigsaw for this, and I'll demonstrate that shortly. Using my panel cutting sled set to 45 degrees, I use my table saw to remove the excess from the panel. For the outside cuts, I'll switch to the bandsaw. Thanks to that bold Sharpie line, I don't need to worry about cutting too close or too far from the edges. I just start cutting from what will be the narrower end of the table, and after the straight cut, I'll move on to the second 45-degree miter. Once that's done, I will continue making cuts until the entire outline is roughly shaped. Here's a safety tip. Sometimes the cutoff will get wedged between the blade and the blade slot in the top. I never try to remove that piece while the saw is running. I turn off the saw, let it come to a complete stop, and then remove the piece. I am sliding a scrap piece of wood under the rough cut piece. Then, I go grab a drill and make a hole large enough to insert the jigsaw to rough out the 2 holes needed for the smaller flower pots. The large hole is right on the edge of the piece, so no starter hole is necessary, and I'll rough that one out too. I attach the template to my roughed out piece, then set up the router table. I put on a pattern flush trimming bit with the bearing on top. The bearing rides along the template, cutting the bottom pieces flush to match. First, I flushed up all the outside edges. Carefully, I lowered the template assembly onto the router bit inside the first flower pot hole, and then trimmed the circle's interior. Even though it may look like I'm rotating the piece clockwise, the router bit actually moves counterclockwise inside the circle against the wood. I do this very slowly and only do about half the circle at a time before stopping the router, lifting up the template, and removing the sawdust and continuing on. This way I don't put too much pressure on the router bit and the cut is much cleaner. Even though the biscuits are meant to assist with the lining of the boards, and I tried to clamp them as tightly as possible, there's still some misalignment in the pieces. So I brought out the planer and ran them through to smooth and flatten the surface just a bit. Now we're making some progress. I used the painter's tape and CA glue trick to attach clamping blocks to the tabletop, getting ready to glue up the miter for the table. Then I applied glue to the edge, positioned all the pieces to ensure everything lined up perfectly, and clamped the joint closed. I left it in the clamps for a couple hours so the glue could dry. Once the glue had cured, I removed it from the clamps and began everyone's favorite part of a woodworking project: sanding. I started with 80 grit sandpaper and worked my way up through the grits to 220. Now it's time to see if our table has legs. But of course, it doesn't, so let's fix that right now. First, we'll cut all the pieces for the legs, which are essentially rails and stiles. Why do we always say it like that? Why can't it be stiles and rails? I'll have to ponder that one day when I have free time. Regardless, I have a gift to complete and the day is coming to a close. We'll need 2 sets of end legs and a center set that will be positioned under the 45-degree miter of the table. Using the miter saw and a stop block, I cut the legs and the center braces to size on the miter saw. The legs will all be 13¼ inches tall, and the 2 end leg sets will be 11¾ inches long, with the center stile of the end leg sets being 7¾ inch long. The 2 end legs have a right and left taper that begins 1¾ inch from the top of the leg and tapers down to 3/4 inch. You will need an inside left taper and an inside right taper on both end leg sets. The outer edge of the leg sets remains at 90 degrees. The center brace has a center taper that starts 3/4 inch from the top and tapers in towards the center of the leg, ending with a footprint of 3/4 inch centered on each leg. I clean up all the tapers on my legs at my oscillating spindle sander. I installed the belt attachment and sanded away all the bandsaw marks from the leg pieces. Using my pocket hole screw jig, I made all the pockets in the leg assemblies. Once the pockets were all made, I put glue on all the joints, clamped them, and screwed them together. I have to let you in on a little secret. I am a moron. That's right, I admit it. I'm a big, gigantic moron. I could use the excuse you hear all around YouTube videos: my camera somehow lost the video footage I wanted to show next. But in real life, I am an IT tech nerd. If it was filmed, I could retrieve it. However, when you are a moron, you have to own it. The following assembly steps are not being shown because I forgot to turn the cameras on. Yep, that's right. I forgot to turn the cameras on. So I went back with my iPhone and I will do my best to tell you how I assemble the legs to the top of the table. It's not the tremendous epic assembly video that I wanted to show, but we'll have to make do. I positioned the end legs of the table 9¼ inches from the front of the narrow end to the front side of the leg assembly. To accommodate seasonal humidity changes, I applied a small dab of glue to the center of the cross stile. Next, I centered the leg underneath the table and secured it with 2 scrap cedar blocks. Using a brad nailer with 3/4 inch brads, I nailed the blocks to the other side of the top and to the leg assembly. This setup allows the top to expand and contract while keeping the leg sturdy. The center legs are centered on the 45-degree miter and built the same way to secure the legs to the top and allow seasonal movement. And here they are, installed with the plants that my wife chose. Do you think I can get away with saying these planters are her next Christmas, Valentine's Day, and birthday presents? Yeah, probably not.